Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into a book that's making some serious waves, The Dawn of Everything. And it's not just a new idea. It's a full-on challenge to a fundamental story we tell ourselves about where inequality comes from. A story that, according to the authors, is not just wrong, but actually holds us back.
You've heard a version of this story before, right? This quote from Rousseau just nails it. We imagine our distant ancestors living in this simple, egalitarian paradise. Then, boom, farming happens. Someone puts up a fence, claims a piece of land, and suddenly you've got property, cities, states, and all the inequality that comes with them. It's this classic story of a fall from grace, where progress means giving up our freedom.
But what if that entire story is just wrong? The authors of The Dawn of Everything say this narrative is basically a trap. It's a story we invented that limits our imagination. And they say the actual evidence from archaeology and history tells a completely different and, frankly, a much more hopeful and exciting story about who we are. So let's get into it. Okay, so to really understand what they're tearing down, we first have to ask, where did our standard story of how inequality began even come from? This is the model that got baked into pretty much all of Western thought. It's this neat stage-by-stage progression. It sets up this really stark trade-off. If you want all the cool stuff, like art, science, and big cities, well, you've got to sacrifice your basic freedoms and accept hierarchy. It makes inequality sound like the unavoidable price of civilization. But here's the book's first big bombshell. What if the people who really kicked off this whole debate in Europe weren't even European? The authors argue that the entire Enlightenment obsession with things like freedom and equality wasn't just some idea they came up with on their own. Nope, it was a direct response to a massive intellectual shock coming from the Americas. And this brings us to what might be the most important and most overlooked piece of the puzzle: the powerful, razor-sharp critique of European society by indigenous Americans themselves. So you've got these European missionaries and explorers writing down everything they see and hear. And these accounts, these Jesuit relations, become huge bestsellers back in Europe. Just imagine, it's the 1600s, you're in Paris, you pick up one of these books, and you're not just reading about canoes and strange customs. You're reading incredibly sophisticated arguments from indigenous thinkers who are just systematically taking apart European society. This wasn't just a travelogue. It was philosophical dynamite. Again and again, these indigenous observers were just baffled by what they saw in European society. They saw people who were constantly yelling at each other, obsessed with competition, who let their own people starve, and who just blindly followed orders from some guy with a fancy hat. From their perspective, Europeans, for all their technology and wealth, lived like slaves. And this quote from a Jesuit missionary gets to the very heart of it. This idea of freedom, the freedom to just ignore a command that you think is wrong or stupid. This wasn't chaos. It was a society that ran on debate and persuasion, not orders and threats. For Europeans living under absolute monarchies, this was a completely mind-bending concept. Now, one of the most brilliant voices of this critique was a Wendat statesman and philosopher named Kandiaronk. This guy was a master orator who, in public debates, just dismantled European claims of being a superior society. His arguments were so powerful that they got published in a book that became a smash hit. He became an intellectual celebrity, and Enlightenment thinkers were basically forced to try and justify their own systems against his logic. So, if our ancestors weren't these simple innocents living in some natural state, what on earth were they doing for all those tens of thousands of years? Well, according to the archaeological record, they were busy creating a wild, vibrant carnival of political experiments. The book just lays it out. The evidence from the ground completely shatters this myth of the simple hunter-gatherer. For tens of thousands of years, it seems, humans were consciously playing around with all sorts of different ways to live together. And the evidence is just stunning. You have these incredibly lavish, princely burials in Russia, covered in thousands of ivory beads. You have Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive temple complex built by people who hadn't even started farming. You have huge settlements of mammoth bone houses from the Ice Age in Ukraine. All this stuff, hierarchy, wealth, public works, existed long before agriculture. But, and this is the key, it was often temporary.
And this is a really crucial point.
Our ancestors were politically self-aware. They knew that different social arrangements were possible, and they would literally just switch between them depending on the time of year. They weren't stuck in any one system.
A perfect example of this comes from classic studies of the Inuit. In the summer, they'd break off into small mobile hunting bands, usually led by a single male patriarch. Pretty hierarchical. But then in the winter, they'd come together in these huge communal houses. And in there, private property basically dissolved. Generosity was everything, and that patriarchal authority just melts it away. They were consciously assembling and disassembling their own political worlds every single year.
So this amazing political flexibility, this ability to just change things up, was all rooted in a set of basic freedoms that, the authors argue, we've pretty much completely forgotten about. And this is where the book really flips the whole debate on its head. The big puzzle of human history isn't where did inequality come from, because it looks like it came and went for millennia. The real, much harder question is, how did we get stuck? How did we lose the ability to just get rid of it? And the authors argue we got stuck because we lost 3 fundamental human freedoms that our ancestors pretty much took for granted. First, the freedom to just move away. If you don't like how things are run, you can leave. Second, the freedom to disobey an order you think is stupid or wrong. And third, the most important one, the freedom to create totally new social realities, to get together with others and just build a different way of living. And you really can't separate these freedoms. They're a package deal. Because once you lose the ability to walk away and you lose the ability to say no, you also lose the power to create something new. And that is how permanent, inescapable systems of domination and state control were finally able to lock into place. So what does all of this mean for us right here, right now? Why is it so important to get this deep history right? Well, the biggest takeaway is this. There is absolutely nothing natural or inevitable about the way we live today. What this new history shows is that for most of our time on this planet, humans have been far more politically creative, playful, and conscious than we ever give ourselves credit for. We made choices about how we wanted to live. That old story, the one about the stages of development, wasn't just some neutral observation. It was a reaction. It was a story invented to basically dismiss that powerful indigenous critique of European society and to make the hierarchies of the time seem like the only possible outcome of history. It trapped us. And that leaves us with a pretty provocative question to end on. If we understand that we're not actually stuck on some predetermined historical track, maybe we can reclaim the freedom our ancestors took for granted. The freedom to imagine and create different social realities. If they could experiment with so many ways of being human, why can't we?